Steve Jobs was a maniacal genius, a magician who could mesmerize people out of their ordinary experience into a magical one. He could also drive those around him to fury and despair. He was a character unlike anyone, a true misfit. His story from a nobody to a technology wizard to his downfall, and then coming back to create the biggest turnaround in the history of business world is remarkable. Something that will inspire people for generations. This is the story of that turnaround. A little context before that. Steve was born on February 24, 1955 in San Francisco, California, when his biological parents were still not married. It was a time when single parenthood was still seen as a disgrace, even in one of the most progressive societies of the world. The only respectable avenue open for a single woman who was pregnant was to give her newborn up for adoption. So within weeks of his birth, baby Steve was given up for adoption. Later in his life, this experience shaped Steve Jobs to be part of something bigger, which could give meanings to his existence. In school, Steve was a loner but smart and a curious kid who was endlessly fascinated with electronics. Reaching high school, Steve met another Steve who was worthy match to his obsession. It was Steve Wozniak, famously called Woz. Jobs was particularly impressed by the fact that there was someone who knew more about electronics than he did. But Wozniak was more than that. He was a technical genius, who was always looking to make any electronic device to run faster and better, just for the fun of it. Steve and Steve made quite a combination. Together, they loved to combine prank playing with electronics. But Steve Jobs wanted to do more. It was at this time they came across an interesting project displayed on the cover of January 1975 issue of Popular Mechanics. It was the first computer kit, the Altair. And this published article had detailed instructions encouraging all interested readers to build the same machine, or they could just buy it from the company which invented it. This was a dream project for electronics hobbyists like Woz. Jobs made it possible for him by getting all the components to do this dream project. Working tirelessly for a couple of months, Woz built and perfected a better prototype than the original. He was extremely happy with his accomplishment and was glad to show the design and plan to anybody who was interested in his invention. This is where the genius of Steve Jobs came in. Having realized that not everyone has the time or patience to build this machine from scratch, he thought it is a good product to sell to other computer hobbyists. Although Woz was happy to give his machine for free, but he let Jobs to do his magic and see if they could make some money off it. Jobs came up with a business plan. Now they just needed some initial investment, but nobody would give money to some random teenagers who claimed that they have made a computer. Hell, not many people knew what a computer was. So to raise the initial funds and pay for the designs and build some devices, Jobs sold his Volkswagen bus for $1,500. While Woz sold his HP calculator for $500. And this is how the Apple computers was born. Before the publication of this article in Popular Electronics, there was no PC industry as such. But by the end of the year, the PC revolution was already on its way, with this duo at the forefront. Jobs figured out how to package and market this amazing new machine. While Woz was the man behind building the first personal computer, it was the obsession and marketing genius of Jobs that made into a blockbuster business. Success of Apple I was quickly followed by world beater Apple II. How the two guys working in a garage revolutionized personal computer industry can be understood by how fortunes of Steve Jobs rose. At 22, his broke and directionless kid. At 23, he had a net worth of $1 million. At 24, it was over $10 million. And at 25, it was over $100 million. He was not only super rich, but the youngest of the super rich. To the public, he was an icon, a handsome young bachelor with a winning smile, a technology groundbreaker who was defining the new world we would all live in. Apple had grown quickly and was no longer just a startup. It now had endless venture capital and professional management to run the business. But Steve's intense personality and obsession for control, which made Apple a great success, was also about to become his poison that would turn powerful people into Steve's enemies and result in his steep downfall. While Steve was the marketing genius and business mind behind Apple, he wasn't happy. The Apple II was his machine. Steve wanted a machine that everyone would know had been created by Steve Jobs. He wanted to show that he could do it, that Wozniak wasn't the only computer genius at Apple Computer. This prompted Steve Jobs to get involved in development of Apple III. He wanted it to be the best computer ever. He became obsessive with this machine to have the best features. At the same time, he was quite unrealistic about the timelines with his development team. Well, he was charismatic and mesmerizing, but he could also become cold and brutal. After some time, everyone working on Apple III was burned out. Some of the changes Jobs was demanding from the team were not possible with the available technology. Due to constant changes, the release of the machine was getting delayed. It was also way beyond budget that was planned for it. Everyone on the team hated Jobs for giving them such a hard time. The issue escalated so much that the board had to remove Jobs from Apple III project. This was his first public humiliation. But when Apple III was finally released, proved to be a failure. Steve had a big role to play, as a lot of changes he had suggested proved to be irreversible later in the life of the project. But blame had fallen squarely on the engineering team. To add insult to the injury, Jobs also took every opportunity to mock the team and humiliate them for their failure. Around the time when Jobs was removed from Apple III, he had started to look to work on something else in the company. It's when he found about an experimental project called Macintosh, which was in R&D. He still had the clout to hijack this project as his own. Steve wanted to do with Macintosh what he couldn't finish doing with Apple III. He wanted Macintosh to be the best-selling computer of all time. But he was about to walk straight into the eye of the storm. Jobs repeated the same mistake he had done with Apple III team. He pushed his Macintosh team so much that they were literally forced to release something which was not 100% ready. It was better designed, but everything else about it was about to fail. The Macintosh was launched with much fanfare, and while it started selling well for the first 100 days, but then slowly the cracks began to appear. It had no internal hard disk drive, had many component failures, and had only a handful of programs while competing with IBM PC, a computer that had thousands of programs on the shelves. The Mac was seen as a toy, a flaky machine that you could love but you wouldn't buy. There was no market research. Steve simply decided what the box should contain, and that was it. The company's reputation for industry leadership was rapidly being undone by the erratic behavior of its chairman. Apple was stalled and sinking. The demand for Steve to let go of Mac division grew stronger, and when its CEO Scully wanted to enforce it, Jobs tried to overthrow him. This was the final straw in the back of the camel. Apple's board took the hard call. Steve was fired from the company he had built. Steve Jobs was not the one who would go down quietly. In a matter of days, he would launch an entirely new company called Next, hire the best and the brightest from Apple, and show the world that it really was Jobs who was the heart and soul of Apple. He wanted to build a product that could change the landscape of education forever. There was a lot of buzz, but unfortunately, Steve hadn't reflected on what his failures at Apple meant. He was blind to the lessons and the problems that had led to his firing. The same cycle was repeating itself. The next computer, the Cube, was delayed in development, and finally, when released to great fanfare, the prospective buyers thought of it as an underpowered machine with a black and white display. Even universities didn't want to buy it when cheaper alternatives were available in the market. As the 80s drew to a close, the Next machine, which had begun in such optimism, seemed to be relegated to a footnote in the history of modern technology. Had Steve Jobs lost his magic touch? His followers were abandoning him. His friends no longer believed in him. The press, which had adored him for so long, now rebuked him. His money was running out, an awesome fortune nearly squandered. He had made $100 million in a handful of years, and now he was blowing it just as quickly on his failing startups. Within a few months, it could all be gone. Super rich and world famous in his 20s, and now in his 30s, he was what? A has-been? A guy who got lucky once but couldn't do it again? a fallen hero? On February 10, 1993, Next announced it was shutting its factory, killing its computer and laying off most of its people. By the end of 1993, Jobs had virtually disappeared from the public consciousness, and then only 2 years later, something happened that seemed like a scene straight out of a popular Hollywood movie. Jobs suddenly re-emerged in the spotlight, triumphant, vindicated, and far richer than ever before. His stunning redemption came from an unexpected source. It turned out that he owned another company, Pixar, which had struggled quietly for a decade. In November 1995, Pixar released the first full-length computer-animated feature film, Toy Story. The following week, Steve took Pixar public, and investors clamored to buy the shares. His 70% stake was certainly worth more than $1 billion. Fortunes of Steve Jobs rose again. But as fate would have it, his first company, Apple, was stuck in a death spiral. The computer world had a new poster boy in Windows Intel PCs. Apple was offering too many products but nobody to buy them. It had changed 3 CEOs. By September 1997, Apple was 2 months from bankruptcy, and no great CEO would join a failing company. Apple board had no choice. It wanted Steve back. But Steve won't listen. To persuade him, Apple acquired Next in an all-cash deal. Steve Jobs, who had co-founded the company in 1976, agreed to return. Die-hard fans of Apple were overjoyed, but the general business world was not expecting much. But the man who returned to Apple was a changed man. When Steve returned to Apple, he was a man wiser and experienced than he had ever been before. He had learned a lot during his days of exile from Apple. The most important thing he learned was discipline, self-control. He understood the fact that design isn't all about how a product looks, but it's rather all about how a product works. Steve did not want to repeat the same mistakes he committed earlier. Next, he unleashed the biggest changes in the corporate world and became the company's unexpected savior. Within a year, things changed radically at Apple. Although many observers had expected Jobs to go for the development of advanced products and generate a deal to get the Apple acquired by a rival, he did neither. What he did was both obvious and at the same time unexpected. He shrunk Apple to the scale and scope suitable to the reality of its being a niche producer in a highly competitive personal computer business. He cut Apple back to the core that could survive. Jobs cut all the desktop models, there were 15, back to 1. He cut all portable and handheld models back to 1 laptop. He completely cut out all the printers and other peripherals. He cut development engineers. He cut software development. He cut distributors and cut out 5 of the company's 6 national retailers. With a simpler product line manufactured in Asia, he cut inventory by more than 80%. A new web store sold Apple's product directly to consumers, cutting out distributors and dealers. The result, he propelled Apple's stock price from $13 a share to $118 a share in less than 3 years, raising the market valuation from less than $2 billion to almost $20 billion. It was an extraordinary resurgence.